Now our speaker is Mr. Pierce. I'm really sorry you were okay. So he is the new product development manager for Polymer Industrial Products Company, or known as PIPCO, since 2013. He has worked in optimizing PIPCO bladder compounds, developed a new thermally conductive bladder compound and new durable release compound for tire and new bladders. He has 28 years experience in the tire and rubber industry. After graduating with bachelor's in biochemistry from Virginia Tech University 1988. Previous to joining PIPCO, he worked for 23 years in the tire industry. He began his career with Yokohama Rubber Company, spending 2 years in Japan training in tire materials and compounding, and worked as compound development engineer and lab manager from 1990 to 1997. He then worked for Sarati Tire and Wheel as senior development chemist, as the company's chief chemist 1997 up to 2006. From 2006 to 2013, he worked as senior development chemist for Cooper Tire. Mr. Pierce, please.
Thank you very much. Companions, Michael, for bringing it to our attention of the Rubber AsiaTech show, and the committee for allowing us to present today. The presentation I'm going to be giving today, hopefully, am I loud enough to hear? Because I move around a lot when I'm talking, but is going to be about curing bladders, and you see the title, Shaping Our World. Well, I put down Shaping Our World because really tire curing bladders are used in making the tires for trucks, buses, passenger cars, taxis, the things that move us around in this world. So that's where that comes from. What I'll be covering is the performance testing, field evaluation of a curing bladder, and then some basic troubleshooting of the curing bladders in the field that a tire plant might see. There we go. The first thing I'll cover is basic bladder requirements for a tire plant. What are they looking for? The curing bladder is going to provide the shaping on the internal part of the tire, pushing the green tire out into the curing mold. And that is important to be uniform and get good consistency in the final cured tire. Also important is the grooving pattern on a curing bladder. The pattern on the outside of the bladder is very important for allowing the air bleed as it's pushing out against the green rubber inside the tire to allow air to flow out instead of being trapped in and against the bladder in the tire as it cures. And then another key requirement for a curing bladder is that it can transfer the heat from whatever curing media is being used. You'll find that some tire plants will use steam, some will use hot water, some will use a combination, and there's nitrogen air, which keeps the pressure on and maintains the temperature in there. So the bladder itself has to perform with all these different media. And it's important, another requirement is that the bladder, once it's stretched and into the proper shape, it'll maintain that shape over many cycles to get better life. And you don't want the bladder to continue to grow and grow, because then you'll get buckles and other issues. And one of the last requirements that I'll point out is the bladder itself is being stretched multiple times, many cycles. So it has to have good flex fatigue life. There's slippage and everything in the inside of the tire, so it has to be abrasion resistant and not wear away. And then also some tire lubricating agents can be or attack the actual rubber. So making sure that's compatible with whatever green tire spray that a tire company may be using is something to look for also. When I mentioned tire curing bladder, many of you probably already seen them, but there's a couple of different types, and they're used for different tires. As you know, there's bias tires out on the market, and then there's radial tires. They serve different purposes. And then there's also what's called a bag-o-matic type tire curing bladder, and then you have NRM tires. The bag-o-matic, you see up at the top here, both are opened at the top and bottom, and the bags are clamped with plates that operate and pull up and down into the tire curing press. We generally on the Magmatics, your upper and your lower openings are the same size. There are other variations such as the, down here at the bottom, you can see the Krupp type. One opening is wider and then the other is narrower, so it gives like an NRM effect. The NRM bladder, you'll notice, has only one opening that's clamped, and the rest of it is in the press, so that there's a ram that pushes it down into the press as it goes through the different cycles. And then I mentioned there's bias in the radial. Generally, a radial bladder has more of a toroidal shape, and it fits into the tire that is already in that toroidal shape, so it matches up better than that. In your bias type bladders, generally they're longer, taller cylinders, and they're stretched and then they're compressed and flow out into the tire and the bias tire and push the plies and give you the motion in the bias for the tire itself. Some of the, as I mentioned, bladder curing cycles, the number of cycles a bladder gets is very important. The service life in the bladder is one of the things tire manufacturers looking for. Some of the key factors that help in getting better bladder life is bladder aging, bladder storage conditions, how the bladders are clamped into the clamp rings before going into the curing press, and then bladder sizing, getting it matched up to the right size for the tire, and the pre-stretch procedure for the curing bladder as it goes into the curing cycle. I'll go over each of these in the next slides. On bladder aging, it's typically taken in the industry that you want to age a bladder at least 30 days. Getting that aging on the bladder after it's been cured is very important to get the best bladder cycle life out. I've seen cases where with greener bladders, they haven't had the age life on them, you can lose 50% of your cure cycles. With one manufacturer that I worked at, we ran into an issue where the bladders hadn't been ordered we made our own bladders at that plant, and production didn't let us know they needed more bladders. Well, we normally got 500 cycles, 400 or 500 cycles out of a curing bladder. We made bladders and gave them directly into production, and they found that they were getting 200 to 250 cycles. So keeping in mind that aging is very important to make sure you get a good life out of your bladders. Bladder storage, it's recommended that if you can, keep them in the sealed boxes that they come in so that they're not exposed to UV and sunlight, which can attack and break down the bladders and cause issues. And you want to store the bladders in a cooler area if possible. This is actually not cycling, but this is going to be a little more difficult to present, but I'll do my best. The cure ring clamping process is the other thing that I was referring to. If the clamps, when they're placed around on the bladder and the T-lock of a curing bladder, generally you want the guideline is 20% maximum compression. The actual neck on the other side of that bead area, you don't want a lot of compression on. The neck is generally, a guideline would be 5% compression in that area when you're clamping it down. And it would be recommended to use like a star pattern, almost like when you put a tire on a car, you don't want to just do one bolt all the way around because that can cock the tire. It's the same thing with doing the clamping on the bead rings. You want to use like a star pattern and generally go down. And in doing so, when you're in the plant, one of the things you would want to look at is for damaged rings, whether they have a burr on it or whether the rings have buildup, because these can be areas that press into that neck and can cause cracking. And if you're getting excessive compression, it'll crack quicker. Now the picture in the background here is actually of one. You can kind of see the excessive compression that has been on this. Generally, you won't see it sink down into the rubber like that. And then it initiated a crack as it's flexing. If it's too much compression in that, when the black bag is cycling, going back and forth, it'll bend right at those clamp areas, and that flex and fatigues quicker, or if you have a burr, it'll actually crack along there, and you can see that going around the line. The other key thing in getting the good life out of a bag is, and maybe one of the main things, is to have proper sizing to the tire. If your curing bladder is too small and it ends up being overstretched, it makes the bladder itself, the walls get too thin, you can have attack by the steam that's going into it. If it's too big and you're trying to push it out into a smaller tire than what it should be, then you might get folds and cause flow issues within that tire. So, but the big concern is if it's trying to use a bladder and stretch it into a tire that it's not really sized up for, because the overstretch can cause buckling and you lose the fatigue and flexibility in the actual bladder. General guidelines that we recommend is for the cross section 10 to 20%. For the circumferential stretch that you would see in sizing out a tire is 20 to 30%. PreStretch process, I mentioned that as one of the key things. On the PreStretch process, generally you want to actually cycle a bladder with the heating medium before starting the actual curing. When the bladder is mounted inside the tire curing press, you'll actually run cycles and stretch it out. But at the same time, you don't want to overinflate it. If you overinflate it, then you're hurting the flexibility, and the bladder then becomes, you can get folds and buckles that will end up causing problems in the actual tire as it cures out. Generally, you want to cycle it about 10 times with the steam and the air in it, because if you try putting a cold bladder in, especially with say an NRM type, that cone or something can break because of being hotter and hadn't been, or cold and hadn't been heated up. And then you don't want to overstretch. Using for example this table here, if your table is the mold, tire mold, you don't want to stretch the bladder so that it's outside of that mold, because that's overstretched. You've over-exercised it. And it's sort of like with a balloon. If anybody's ever done balloons before, you stretch them to a certain bit before inflating them, and they'll do well. If you don't get good stretch on it, or it's incomplete, you stretch one part of it and the other, you'll get the balloon will inflate in a certain area in one area and then be small in the other, and you have issues with it. It's the same thing with a curing bladder. You're inflating it out, and you want to get it sized right for that tire mold and that tire you're going to be putting it in. Okay. The next I'll go over is field testing evaluation. Everything's on the screen, so I will try not to read it directly. But basically, the first step when doing a field evaluation with a tire company, each tire company has their own process. Everybody does it a little bit differently. But general guidelines is you want to confirm the state of cure of the tire. You want to make sure that the bladder is giving them the right amount of cure for the time they're curing the bladder. Some companies will do what's called a blow point check. They'll just check to make sure there's no porosity at the certain cure time in key areas such as the bead or in the shoulder near the belt. Others will actually go and do a full evaluation, what's called a thermocouple, where they'll take a green tire and insert wires in the different key locations, the belt edge, the bead area, the center of the tread, the thickest part. And then that green tire with the wires is put into the press, and it'll be cured out, and they'll monitor how well the temperature is going up at all those key areas. And they can see whether or not the bladder is giving them proper curing versus what they normally have. Some of the things from a bladder manufacturer standpoint that you can get from doing the thermocouple or doing the cure evaluation is whether the gauge is right at the bladder. Is a different compound needed? Do they need a highly thermal compound to get the cure rate to the level that they're looking for versus what the tire company may be used to? The next other key thing in a field evaluation is to confirm that the tire shaping is okay. As I mentioned, if the tire bladder, if it's too small and is being overstretched, then you can see buckling or folds in the tire as it's cured out. You wouldn't have, maybe it would be off balance and you wouldn't get good uniformity in the finished cured tire. So those are something that you want to look at when you're doing a field evaluation of a new bladder in a match with a tire. Next would be to evaluate a bladder with 5 or 6, or evaluate the number of cure cycles with 5 or 6 different bladders. They may look at it in different presses. A tire manufacturer may want to look at it with a couple of different tire sizes to make sure it's going to work in those. And they're going to want to look at how the life cycles they're getting with that new bladder, and generally they'll look at it side by side with one of the bladders that they're looking at or that they normally use to make sure it compares well. If all of that looks good, then an extended trial of say a dozen bladders would be generally arranged. Those bladders would be sent, and then the plants would run their trials over a few weeks or a month. And then if everything goes good there, you'd get final approval for your bladder. Next slide I'll do is troubleshooting. A lot of times a tired customer may call up and they say, we have a bladder that runs X in press mold array. Press and mold A, but over here in Y, press mold B, we're not getting the same number of cycles, not the same life. In investigating some cases, we found it may be a case of in press B, they're actually using, and this would be in the case of an NRM type bladder where the ram is pushing down, they're using a smaller ram head, so the concentration of the pressure from that ram hitting down on the nose cone inside the bladder actually is causing greater stresses, and it causes the nose cone to rupture or have a crack in it compared to what they're getting in press A. Another such case would be a tire company in some cases may be running the presses in A 3 shifts of a day, all day long, and the press in B would only be running 1 shift or 2 shifts, and then the rest of the time the bladder is left down in the well at the high temperature. Well, this can result in poor bladder life because you'll get dry heat aging of the curing bladder that's sitting down in that mold over that time period. Whereas if the bladder was taken out or removed, it may get better life. There have been cases of the bladder, we've been using this for 4 years. We get X number of cycles, but over the last year, we were only seeing Y number of cycles. It's not getting as good. So one of the first things you have to do is ask what has changed over that time period. Has there been anything changed on the curing bladder side? Is there anything changed in the plant? In some cases, we found that cure temperatures, in past years, many tire manufacturers use curing temperatures of 300, 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Sorry, I don't have the Celsius conversion on the top of my head, but, and then in recent years, we're seeing more tire manufacturers are saying they're using 380 or even 400 degrees Fahrenheit. This is a lot higher temperature, and that can have an effect on the curing bladder's life. And that's the higher temperatures end up resulting in a little bit lower life. And I'll close with going over just some examples of common field issues that may be seen in the tire curing bladder that may have to be addressed. Internal blistering, delamination, cracks and tears that you might see in a nose cone or in the other parts of the bladder, and then outer cracking on the pattern. You know, I mentioned the pattern was very important. The outer area gets some cracking. In the first picture here, you can see the small little perforations or areas in the bladder. A lot of times this is caused by oxygen level in the water steam that's being used, and it can cause cracking and attack on the bladder surface. And then these slowly, as they form up, they can cause earlier failure in the bladder or cause issues with the tire production. Effective water treatment chemicals can sometimes attack the inside of a bladder. And actually the way the steam is actually ported into the inside and the curing cycle, you can there's been cases where you're seeing the direct steam inlet is going directly into a shoulder area of the bladder as it's going out, instead of being dispersed uniformly throughout, the steam itself going directly into that area. And the rest of the bladder might look okay, but you see the small porosities and stuff on the inside due to that. So that's something that a tire plant can look for. The delamination, a lot of times this is due to overstretch. I mentioned if the tire bladder is not sized properly and it's overstretched, you're actually thinning the walls on that a lot, and you're taking the life flexibility of that bladder down. And this can result in the start of maybe pinholes due to the stretching, and then the steam and everything can get in there, and it will actually cause laminations in the bladder and cause it to slowly fail layer by layer until it gives out. The other thing could be undispersed filler or curatives in the cured rubber itself. Generally, the bladder manufacturer would do screening of the extruded slugs that are used to make the product. But if there was a case where a particle or undispersed curative managed to get through, you could have a hot spot in that area, which would end up causing a possible pinhole that would then open up and allow delamination like this. Cracking and tears, I mentioned the nose cone. If there's too much pressure, or if the nose cone, the bladder has some tilt in it, you can actually get the ram hits on it and causes stresses in that nose cone, which would result in cracking through the nose cone area. Forcing a cold bladder down into the well, or actually using the ram as the main thing that's pushing or getting the bladder out of the cured tire. Those are some things that can actually result in nose cone cracking. And then on the last one, pictures up, it's kind of hard to see, but right in this area, there's actually cracking down to the groove area of the pattern. And a lot of times this will be due to the high heat, and if the bladder is laying out on the well, as you can see, this particular bladder is pushed down and left in the well, and it's got areas that are under high stress, and you can get dry heat aging and cracking in that particular area that slowly shows up in the groove pattern of the actual bladder, and then this slowly breaks down and you get earlier failure and fatigue life in the bladder. Exposure to light and UV rays, as I mentioned, that can be something that attacks the bladder compound and causes it to start breaking down quicker. Sort of like the term dry rot with, I know my dad, when I was younger, had what was called fishing waders, and they were made out of the butyl or neoprene type. And if they were left hanging on a coat rack or hanging on a rod in the closet, and you could go in and you ended up finding they had cracks in it. You get in the water with them and go get ready to go fishing, and they had water coming in and leaking in. So it's like, wait, how'd that happen? You know, they were protected inside. It was just the fold and light and things hitting it. And that can happen on a curing bladder also. In summary, like I said, curing bladders help shape and cure the tires that move our world. So they're a key component for tire manufacturers to be able to produce the tires that we run and use every day in our life. Attention to several of the key factors in how the bladder is made and how they're used in the plant can help in better service life for the tire manufacturer, and that's what we aim for. And working closely with the tire manufacturers, getting good communication and discussion, being able to visualize what some of the failure areas or trouble may be found in the plant, it can help us identify and work with the tire manufacturer to address any issues that are out there. And just good communication helps with the troubleshooting. Thank you.
Open.
Thank you very much for your presentation. You have mentioned that groove cracking is one of the reasons is the attack of inside paint is a probable cause for that.
It's one possible cause.
Yes.
For the cracking that's seen in the pattern on the outside of the bladder, inside tire paint, if it's not directly compatible with the bladder, it can have an effect. In some cases, a lot of companies will use a bladder or request a bladder coating, and that gives it a protective coating that prevents the paints from attacking it. But there are some cases where
Okay, if that is the case, we are identifying as inside paint is the what is the property we look into that inside paint to avoid this?
I don't have a specific property of what's causing it. It's just something. It's not every inside paint. There have been cases where the inside paint reacts and has issue with the curing bladder and the particular compound. But also, as I said, the temperature, dry heat aging of the bladder can result in some cracking in that area. How the pattern is actually designed and whether it has sharp corners or some bevel to it can play an effect, the depth of it. So, but the specific chemical property that causes the cracking, I don't have a good answer for that now.
Okay, thank you. Hi, my name is Gajen Zinani. I'm from Reliance. You talked about uniformity of bladder, and bladder manufacturing is shifting from a compression molding to injection molding for this purpose only. So my question to you, generally compression molding, even cavity is a uniform, but we get a top half is a thicker than bottom half. So do you have do you have any suggestion we can control that uniformity in a compression molding, or injection is the only answer for that?
That's a good question. I think the jury's still out there on that. We're looking. We actually are going to and putting in injection, but our particular company has been compression molding for the years. Keeping the slug weight and the pressures and stuff, you can get generally good uniformity in the bladder. Some bladder types are more difficult than others. The size of the bladder can affect that, but generally keeping the gauges has not been an issue. I know from the literature from the injection press manufacturers that injection molding is touted as being one way to get very uniform results, and that should give better overall bladder life. Like I said, we're just getting into injection molding and how that consistency, I don't have the data at hand to say one way or the other at this point. We have talked to some customers, tire manufacturers that use both, and in some cases they feel that injection molded bladders give them better uniformity and better life, and in other cases they can go either way. They don't see a real difference. So again, I think some of that comes back to where and how it's being used at the tire manufacturers.
Limited from Pune. My question is, the bladders have to be stored in a closed condition, okay, without light and air, controlled like that. So whether we can keep the bladders in folded condition? My first question. And the second question is, what is the average life of bladders if you consider truck bias and truck radial and PCR?
The first part of your question was just about storage and how long to store it, or how long after you take it out of storage. do you start seeing deterioration in life? Is that
Folded condition.
folded condition? Keith, you wanna help on that one?
Depends on the condition of the storage area.
It depends on the condition of the storage area. If the bladders are folded and you've got them out, but there's not a lot of, if it's not real high temperature and it's a cool area, they're gonna last better. If you don't have other chemicals or other materials around in that area, it's more of a clean area, it's probably gonna last and be better. It's not gonna deteriorate so quickly. How much sunlight is actually detrimental? Does it have to be kept in the dark? Dark would be better than overhead light. Overhead light would be better than, say, sunlight. Actual data on how quickly those effects are, I don't have, I don't know anyone that actually has that information, at least we have. On the second part of your question was, the life cycle for different bladder types, whether truck, bus, or passenger. And the answer to that, again, is the condition that's being run. I mean, we've got bladders, it could be the same bladder, and one manufacturer is using it in this particular tire, and they get 50 to 100 cycles and they're happy. The same bladder and another manufacturer uses it in a tire where maybe it's matched better to the size, they're not trying to overstretch and all, they might get 500 cycles. But in truth, depending on the application and where and how it's being done, you could have a bladder that might get a normal 200 to 250, but at another place they might get 900 to 1,000. Generally, in my history, what I've seen, generally you're looking to have anywhere from 300 to 500 cycles for the life cycle of the bladder. The different applications, how they stretch out into the tire, and the conditions of different plants can affect that.
I just would like to add on a couple of things. Coming to your question of non-uniformity of the gauge of the bladders. Now, I'm representing my bulk. So we make both the compression and the injection molded. And the injection molded gives much better uniformity. One of the main reasons for the non-uniformity of the compression molded is the shifting of the core. The core shifts, and the slugs which you're using are very hard compounds. And in case if the core is not fixed properly and there is a flexibility, and then you have the height of the core, and then it bends. And the moment it bends, normally you start getting a variation in the gauge that can be clearly assessed. At the moment you see a gauge variation, you can ascertain that it is the shifting of the core, because the thickness would go more on one side, less on the other side, which is a clear indication of the shifting of the core. If you have to have much better uniformity, what they are getting with their cores is the core does not shift. I hope that answers your question. And then the other person coming from Classic about the folded edges. So normally when you have the folded edges, similar to what you see in the tubes, the moment it comes into the folded edges is highly susceptible to ozone attack. And the strains are more, and the ozone attacks and the cracks are more. To avoid such cracks, it is preferable to avoid the force, excessive force. And that is why even we suggest when we are talking about the tubes, we keep a little bit of air in the tube so that the folds are rounded and they are not folded. And the moment the strain is more, it is highly susceptible. So it is preferable to avoid the folds in your bladders to avoid the cracks.
So my question was actually, suppose if we fold the bladders and we wrap it in all the bladders in a box, and again we wrap it in polythene and close the lid of the box, and if we store like that, where the air
polythene is not impermeable. It does, the ozone permeates, and you will find when you are stacking up the bladders, the cracks will be more on the bottommost, which is a clear indication there is an ozone attack, and it is because of the highly high amount of stream which is there in the folded edges.
Okay,
So polythene is not going to prevent the ozone from permeating.
so even if we enclose it in a box, plastic box,
It doesn't. So it's better to retain the shape to avoid the pores.
Thank you, sir.
Practically, I'll tell this presentation is basically an overview on bladder. He started everything, like different type of bladder, selection of bladder, how you can store the bladder, how to fix the bladder, different troubleshooting during manufacturing bladder. It covers almost everything. Excellent presentation, but I have one last question. If you have time, you can tell, otherwise you can conclude the session. We concentrate on conductive bladder so that your cure cycle time you can reduce. Do you manufacture that kind of bladder or any information on that?
We do have a thermally conductive compound that provides better cure cycle like that. It's very difficult to get tire companies to be interested in it generally, though, because of the formulation requires different types of fillers that allow for that thermal conductivity, and it ends up making the cost of the compound more, so the bladder cost is generally more expensive.
How expensive it is? These are 1.5 times or 20% just, or what kind of cost?
Maybe off the top of my head, 15 to 20% higher. But it's getting companies to take a look at the overall cure cost. If you can take a minute out of cure for every cure cycle, that adds up over a year. So, you can get a lot of thermal, you can get a lot of energy savings and cure time savings if it was across, a large number of other people.
Thank you. I think let's give a big hand to him. Excellent presentation.
Request Chairman to present a memento to speaker. So with this presentation, we have come to the end of this session 8 because the last presenter is not available. So thank you, Chairman. And may I request Sirian sir's presence on the dais to give a memento to Chairman? Please, sir.